And we are live. So it's probably going to take a few minutes for people to show up, but we're going to go ahead and start our intro. So I am J.E. Prazzi, speculative fiction writer and the author of the Malfunction Trilogy and the Raven Tree Society and many, many short stories. And we are here today to celebrate the release of my book, Connection, which is the last book in the trilogy. I am joined by Beth, science fiction author EB Dawson. So Beth, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm EB Dawson. I write mostly science fiction, a little fantasy, and go by Beth. My main science fiction series is The Creation of Jack, but then I also have a couple standalones. They're both retellings. Ahab and Watson and Holmes are both kind of science fiction retellings of classic stories. So, and I'm a huge science fiction nerd. I love reading and watching it and talking it. So, yes. I'm happy to be here.
So I'm just going to preface this with saying we are not very professional on my channel. If you guys have already noticed, I have like a little monstrosity climbing all over me, and that is my cat Pidge, who very much likes to destroy my streams. Add to that the fact that I just got over a cold, so I'm a little bit scratchy, but we have fun, and that's the most important part. So that's our goal for today, is to have fun, not to be super polished. Yes. So I don't see anyone here yet. So if you are here, go ahead and drop a hello in the comments and let us know if you're watching. But I'm going to kind of lay out what we're going to do for today. So we're just going to kind of chat about tropes mostly. So I wanted to focus in on some of the fun tropes that I have in the Malfunction Trilogy, but both of us are science fiction nerds, as Beth has already brought up. So we're going to nerd out about some tropes. If you guys have anything to say about the tropes, anything you want to add, please let us know in the comments. And if you have any questions, you can pop them in there as well. But yeah, we're just kind of hanging out and being nerds, which is what we do best. Mm-hmm. This is what I do for fun.
Enjoying a nice Sunday afternoon.
Exactly. So, yeah, go ahead and let us know when you're on, and give us a hi or a hey ho or a Heidi ho or whatever works for you. So yes, Beth, you are a big science fiction nerd and a science fiction writer. And one of the most obvious things when people are comparing our series, which happens every once in a while,
it does,
is that both of our series has the super soldier trope in various different ways. So that's what we're going to talk about first, is the super soldier trope. So Beth, do you have any shows or books or franchises that stick out to you when you hear the super soldier trope?
Yeah, I feel like it's so prominent across a lot of science fiction, even in little ways. We're just, as humans, we're just fascinated with how far human abilities can go, you know, especially, I mean, you look at the past 100 years with advances in medicine and even technology and how it increases our life expectancy and our health and all, pushing the limits. It fascinates us. Now it's like the Olympics, you know, you're like, I can't run a mile that fast, but I love watching other people do it because I feel like I'm a human too. Look what humans can do. I think, yeah, to pick one that stands out, well, it's hard because I feel like, which in general in fiction, I create my favorite stories myself. But, I know in Star Trek, though, there's a couple. The one that popped into my head, which I don't know, I would say is my favorite, but 7 of 9 in Voyager is an interesting, because she was assimilated by the Borg, and so she's got like some strengths and abilities that seem superhuman or a little bit more than the other humans, but it sets her apart also. But makes for some interesting questions. You give one of yours, and I'll think of another one.
Well, I mean, everyone is familiar with Bucky Barnes now and that super soldier trope, and there are multiple super soldier concepts in the whole Marvel universe. But I think when I think of super soldier first, and it's a really weird one because it's not even technically a super soldier, but there is this movie, can't think of the name off the top of my head anymore, and it's got, I believe, Mel Gibson in it. And he's kind of a Manchurian candidate. Conspiracy theory. That's it. And he's kind of been like kidnapped and brainwashed and forced into this like Manchurian candidate program. But the movie kind of follows the aftermath where he just seems like this like bonkers homeless like taxi driver. And he seems like he's just like following this girl around. And so he seems really like a like insane creep. But then as you find out more, and honestly, it's hilarious. It's really funny. But as you find out more, you find out that he's like this extremely capable like assassin in this Manchurian candidate like program. And he's been brainwashed and like taught all these like these skills, and they're trying to like get him back. And so it's like this really interesting twist on the idea of the super soldier where, like I said, it doesn't really stick closely to the trope because he's not technically like a superior human in any way. But it's more almost like a I mean, I guess if I can bring it into modern terms, since we're all on Marvel when it comes to superhumans, he's more of a like Black Widow type of soldier, as like highly trained. And for some reason, that's like the first thing that pops in my head when I think of super soldiers. I'm not entirely sure why.
Yeah. I can't believe I forgot about Bucky. I love Bucky. But I haven't been watching a lot of Marvel lately, so there's a lot. I feel like, yeah, it's hard to think of when you actually sit down to think of them. There's a lot of that go like part way, or like I know several shows, like staple science fiction shows, would do like for an episode they find something device that makes their people like soldiers super strong, but then there was always a downside, so they never use it. Like I know Stargate had some episodes like that. I think Eureka probably did too, which is interesting. So I'm trying to think of the ones that actually committed to like, because it's hard if you make them too super and they're indestructible, obviously that's not interesting.
Yeah.
So sometimes I think shows or movies don't fully commit to like, oh yeah, they're actual super soldiers, because that can be hard to make interesting, or it can be tricky to work with.
I think a lot of times it's used as a threat.
Yeah, or the bad guys are the super soldiers, and we have to fight the super soldiers. I don't know.
An unconventional super soldier that I love, Chuck, from the show Chuck. He gets a supercomputer like downloaded in his brain.
Yeah, I would not like think of him as super soldier, but technically, I guess by the definition, yeah, that's a funny. They do some very unique things in that show.
Very unconventional super
soldier. Great character.
I guess technically he'd be a super spy.
Yeah, I feel like he'd be a super spy by definition.
So I guess that's
in and then I guess in Edge of Tomorrow, Live Die Repeat. Those I think would be by definition super soldiers, but they're not actually bionically. They just have suits, super suits.
Yeah.
But they fight. Yeah, that's a cool example, I think, of a different way to go about it. They fight with a super suit, so they can do way more than humans can do on their own, but they're still fully human.
Yeah. And they play with that trope too in The Expanse, with the super suit version of the super soldiers, because then you have like the Martian Marines have those like really cool exoskeletons.
Yeah, and they do a lot of that. That's true.
Yeah, which Bobby, the character who runs around with a super suit the most, she's practically a super soldier on her own.
Pretty fierce and strong.
I'm actually reading the book right now, and it's kind of funny how often they're dropping like, oh yeah, she's Polynesian, and that's why she's so big and strong. Yeah, she's Polynesian, and it's like, okay, cool. So apparently Polynesian people have superpowers.
I believe it.
I totally believe it.
Probably all Islanders. Islanders are cool people.
Yeah, put them on Mars and you got extra superpowers, right?
Yes. So
I find it interesting that when we look at kind of like the augmented human being, whether it be like bionic or genetic or like some sort of serum or something like that, it seems like when it's used in fiction, it's always used in like a military type threat. Do you notice that?
Well, it's a natural association. I mean,
yeah,
because if somebody, just knowing how governments work, I actually talk about that in one of my books a little bit. If somebody has heightened skills, and that it can give the military an edge, because there's a limit to what humans can do, which is why, we build technology and weapons from military. It just would be hard to imagine somebody like that who was enhanced or things like that. I mean, unless they completely kept it on the down low, it would be hard to imagine like the government and military hearing about it and not trying to go after them to study them, or, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I think that's why it's so closely associated.
Yeah. And it does make me wonder, like, definitely we're moving towards kind of a transhumanist future, however that might look. It makes me wonder what some of the first usages of things like bionic enhancements or that kind of stuff will be, whether we're going to use, and we kind of already see some of that in some like military attempts at military stuff, but most of it right now is in kind of a medical field. Mm-hmm. Or in video games, actually. But I do wonder if you have any, like, are there any instances where you kind of see like a superhuman that's not used in a military capacity?
I think that usually like that would be superheroes are often their own, and that's more law enforcement, so almost more, in that sense. But I feel like that's the kind of, if it's not military, then it's a superhero thing. That's just my instinct, is that, and that's where you get the secret identities where they don't want to tell anybody because they don't want to be studied or exploited. You know what I mean? Like, you're like, oh, I have to think if there's anybody else. I mean, there's Doctor Who, but he's another species, so maybe that doesn't count. I was trying to think of, he just kind of does what he wants, and he likes to help people, but yeah, he's another species, so that doesn't count. Because it's like, what would you do would you live an ordinary human life if you had other abilities, or would you try to use them? And I think most fiction says you would try to use them. And then that you get, people would find out about you. And so that's why, it kind of inevitably leads down to a certain number of paths at that point. But that would be an interesting thing to try to write a story about somebody with enhanced abilities who was able to keep it secret and didn't do law enforcement or military, go either of those routes.
Yeah. It definitely is kind of like an interesting thing to think about. And it seems like we as human beings, like we often put ourselves into a power dynamic. So it's like, okay, do you have like might makes right? And this kind of concept of like, if you have superpowers, to be a moral human being, to have these powers, you either need to be using those powers to protect others, or you will be using them to exploit others. But I also find it funny that we have the mentality, whereas like on a normal basis, like we may not have superheroes yet, but we do have people with different ability levels. And we don't have quite those same expectations in normal society of people different ability levels of saying, you know, you're really good with computers. And so we have these expectations for you to use those there. It's usually used more in like when I see people in society use those, unless you're like a virtuoso, it's kind of like, you know, you're letting yourself down by not using this talent or skill or, you know.
Yeah. There's like, yeah, we have different expectations of what's in the normal range of human ability and what's not.
Yeah.
It's interesting to think about.
So what do you think is required of the superhero trope in order for it to like fit into that superhero? Or not superhero, super soldier.
To fit into.
Yeah. So you think, like, for instance, I know we talked about like bionics and genetics, and we kind of talked about the superhero genre. But do you think, like, at what level does it become a super soldier? Is it a super soldier specifically because he or she has been altered in a physical form, or could it be like super in certain skills, or, you know?
Yeah, I think it can be quite broad. I think the most popular are like genetic manipulation or having like sort of some sort of cybernetic implants are like the most commonly that people think of. And sometimes there's a combination. Like I know in Malfunction, your super soldiers have DNA modification and implants, and of course intense training, kind of like, and psychological, like the whole gambit.
Yeah.
Poor buddies. But I think like in Edge of Tomorrow, like I think you can count like those are super soldiers, and I guess in Starship Troopers has a similar. They have suits that make them super soldiers. You know, they're soldiers who use technology in a sense, and it's not just like they're carrying it. You know, it becomes like an extension of them. I think is what makes that kind of makes them the super. I think the most interesting are the specialized ones, like you were saying, when that's like, because sure you can be like, oh yeah, this is this whole army and they all have super suits so they can all do the same functions, but I think it's more interesting when that's like this one individual has exceptional ability in a certain area and this one has, you know, and it sets them apart from each other or from others. So whether it's like, they had their genes or they had DNA manipulation or something that makes them super intelligent, or certain proclivities to certain strategies, or I don't know. But again, that's because storytelling is most centered on individual characters, and that's why it makes it interesting, I think.
Yes, definitely. And then I was also thinking how both of us, in both of our books, both the Malfunction Trilogy and in Creation of Jack, where we both kind of share this super soldier trope, both of us have super soldiers that are kind of impressed into the service. It's not entirely by their choice. In Creation of Jack, you know, there's some choice given, but it's more of the illusion of choice, I guess. So why do you think that it's so common? And I know that there are a lot of other stories in which that's also a thing, you know, Bucky Barnes, of course, where it's not really a choice. Why do you think that we like those kind of stories, that we like using that particular concept?
That's a great question. It makes me feel like, oh man, that sounds terrible. I should feel really guilty for it. Those are the interesting stories. I think I'm thinking about the first time that I saw The Bourne Identity, and why it was so interesting was that because he was this trained to be an assassin, which you're like, okay, a terrible person. But the fact that he got wiped clean, and I don't know that he's technically a super soldier. He's just really, really trained. But I'm just still going to use that example.
Yeah.
Because he got wiped clean is suddenly like this blank slate with these really specific skill set that normal people don't have. And then you have the questions there of the moral choices of who's he going to choose to be, or can he actually use that experience and those things for good, even though to get to that place, he would probably have not have been a good person, if that makes sense. You know what I mean? And that's why I was so fascinated by it. And honestly, it inspired a lot of the creation of Jack series, or definitely inspired a strong thread of it, of like, you know, wanting to be like, okay, if there was a dark organization training people like this, and because some of those, you know, you would have to cross lines, moral lines for certain training or certain, and so you recognize, okay, all the people in that would probably, you know, be morally ambiguous. But what if there was someone who was pressed in against their will, and they would just have a different perspective on it, I think, you know. And for I know, again, in your series, for Bass, it wasn't a choice because he was like raised in it. And so it gives the character a whole different, well, it gives you as an author a whole different set of tools. And just to be, it's a beautiful ground to ask questions about personal and individual agency, you know, and what they're going to choose to do with the abilities that they've been given. And I think also there's the whole level of, you know, if do they belong to the government or are they free people? You know, if once you get to that point where it's like, okay, if they're super soldiers and the government's paying for them to be turned into it, they kind of are almost property of the government. And you get into that ground too, which makes for really interesting questions philosophically.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that answers the question, but for
me, I think that's definitely.
That's the whole thing with Bucky. It's like, you know, he was like hypnotized and brainwashed for so much of it. It wasn't actually his choices or his, and then he finds himself in this position. That's why we identify and love him so much.
Yeah.
Like, oh no, there's, you know, he's still the person that he was that Steve knew him as, and yet he's in these different circumstances. Anyway.
Yeah. Yeah, it kind of sets you on and I think that you're right on how with some of these super soldiers, and in fact, I'd say most of them, in order for them to become super soldiers, you kind of have to start from a moral gray ground, you know? And a part of that is just like the power dynamic. Like we talked about like kind of how that power dynamic fascinates us and how we feel like if you have power, you need to either use it for good or for evil. But then the question is like, if someone chooses that power in the first place, right? They choose to have the power to be able to like do all these skills, especially if those skills are specifically like aggressive by nature.
Yeah.
You know, so if they're choosing that, then they're choosing to have these skill sets to kill people, whether they're good people or bad people, you know, it's still kind of, but if you set them up as being kind of forced on them, and then you can be able to ask the question of well, what do you do with this once you have it? And it adds a lot of complexity.
Yes,
to the decision making.
We love the complexity.
Yes, and I do think now I as an author also tend to gravitate to conflicting ideas. So, you know, for instance, like with Bass, so he's a super soldier and he's aggressive and he's built as a weapon, but at the same time, like he definitely hits like that gentle giant trope where he's, you know, sweet. And so I like to play with those extremes there. And I do think that there's might be some of that as well, where, you know, it's someone with all this power and at the same time powerless. So it's a very interesting dynamic with that as well. And like, what do they do, when they have more power,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, absolutely. I personally, you think about, it's a little scary to think about, like, oh, if humans could, obtain certain power or be strong, like you set up these super soldiers, and it's kind of terrifying to think about. And I like to have that's why for me, it's almost comforting to have the at least morally conflicted character. You know what I mean? Or almost like someone who has the same abilities and same power and same skill set, and yet has a moral conscience, and can defend the weak against the other super soldiers.
Yeah.
No, but it's kind of comforting of like, okay, if and also I think if it's possible, if great evil can exist in the world, we need to set up great good against it, type of thing. And if that makes sense, to have the both sides there. So, but it's it can be a complicated setup to do it believably. But it's just, there's just a fact of it that, the military it's like you need a certain mindset going in. Even just the military we have as it is, to go into battle, you have to shut off certain parts of your brain, and you know what I mean, like to cope. And then if you take that to the next level, where you're talking about super soldier and different type of trainings and whatnot, and the mental strain it would take, I don't remember where I was going with that, but it gets complex real fast. And that's why it feels like, how could you keep your humanity through that sometimes, with these situations? And that's why it's beautiful to show the characters who do keep their humanity through that, even if they've, like Bucky, even if they have been so traumatized, almost beyond what you would think a human can take. It's beautiful to show like how resilient people can be. And so that's where I was going with it. I think.
Yeah, I like that. And I also think that there's a lot of power in being able to see a victim get power over their life and not use it to create more victims.
Yeah.
To see someone, we have so much victimization in the world around us, and we see victims everywhere, and so to be able to see those victims become empowered and then choose for whatever reason, and hopefully the creator of the story sets up a good solid reason for that. But to see those victims have power, and I'm thinking about Hulu has The Handmaid's Tale, and I've watched a few things, but I saw a few clips recently, and I think I wasn't even like watching them all the way through, but they're kind of showing these characters who have been victims, like becoming abusers. And I think that's kind of the common trend that we see, like people who are abused become abusers. And so like, I see the benefit of showing that in fiction is kind of like a warning against abusing people. But I think there's also a great power of showing people who have been abused and people who've been victimized, who have come to a place of power and can make the right choice, and can use those experiences in a positive way instead of lashing out, instead of like subjugating and victimizing other people.
Yes, which is ironic because you hear the term super soldier and you don't think, oh, they're a bunch of victims walking around. But I know you're referring specifically to the one where they've been like blackmailed in or put in by force. But I think in general, it's true. It's like, I don't know, there's a lot to consider. It's like, if they signed on, did they know fully what they were getting into if it was experimental? And even so, even if they went fully in, it's not like they knew the cost of what it could do psychologically. I don't think anyone knows beforehand exactly what war is going to cost you if you go into it, you know what I mean? And so there's a lot of damage done. There will be, if that's what you do. And like you said, I think you put it perfectly. They can that can make them, they can let that fester, right, and become angry or emotionless people, you know what I mean, or let that impact them in negative ways, and then it will impact the people around them. Or like you said, I think it's beautiful to show the other sides of that, of what it could be, which is a big thing I know of what your Malfunction theories is about.
Yes.
So yes, we need more stories like that.
Yeah, I did find it very interesting, and kind of in the decision in connection, and for anyone who reads it, don't think this would be spoilery, but as a choice, like whenever I started developing one of my super soldier characters, to make the choice to more often than not put them in a positive light, and because they had experienced suffering, to want to relieve others of suffering. And so it was really interesting to kind of bring that dynamic, especially when for the entire world of Malfunction, there's so much victimhood in so many different places, and you see, especially in the first book, how people use that against each other. And this will actually kind of feed into the next point, because the next thing we wanted to talk about, so we can go ahead, kind of move on to the next trope, unless you had something you wanted to add about the super soldier stuff, is kind of the idea of like classism. And that's one like a major trope in Malfunction, and I think we see that in a lot of dystopian, and I also think that a lot of people mistakenly say it's dystopian if it has extreme classism in it. But in a lot of science fiction we're building, we have that classism, that the upper class and the lower class and the middle class, and that dynamic between them, and the power structures, which are even more extreme when you add in like access to technology, which we're even seeing in the world that we live in. What access to clean water and good food can do for a country with technology, when a country that doesn't can be struggling. But yeah, so I was going somewhere with this.
The victimhood and classism. And
yes, yeah. I think like in Malfunction, I had in the first book, you see a lot of like people in these classes like trying to gain power and oppressing each other and oppressing the people in lower classes, and it being used as this kind of, we have to survive, and in order to survive we use other people, and with my super soldiers, like making the choice to paint them in a different light and say, look, like they've been on the bottom rung, so when they have the ability to climb to the top rung, like they don't make the same choices. But yeah, I think that definitely kind of ties in, and I think that's one of the reasons also, so in Malfunction I have Minerva and Kao both belong to like one of the upper echelons, one of the top classes, but I think in a lot of science fiction we see people from like the bottom classes climbing up. Or like overthrowing the government or something like that. So kind of on that topic of classism, like why do you think that's such a popular trope in science fiction when it comes to world building, to build in those like extreme classes? Because it almost seems like, as the world grows, we're kind of growing away from that, at least in some of the Western countries.
Well, I mean, for one thing, you have to have conflict in your science fiction story. And if it's not going to be aliens or, you know what I mean, then it's humans against humans. And so you look at what would potentially cause conflict in future societies. And I think also, and a big one answer to that is class, because class always has conflict. But also I think a huge role of science fiction is kind of taking philosophical what ifs and running with them and taking them to the extreme. And we see so many things in society, even in history, even if they're not relevant today, it's so fun to look back and say, what if that situation had continued to develop and turned into, I think a lot of it comes from that, because just kind of playing with like, what if, these even microcosm situations had continued unchecked, and what would the world look like today? And as humans, we like to play with those hypothetical questions. But I mean, also as humans, I think there's just that, I don't know, striving against each other. It just comes a little too naturally, you know, and that wanting to be, I don't know. It's hard to imagine a classless world.
Yeah.
I feel like there's always, it's so easy for us to envy each other, even if, you know what I mean? It's like, and to want to see other people who have things that we don't have, even if it's not technically another class, and say, I want to get to that place, you know, and to kind of view them. And for people who have achieved, to maybe look down on the ones who haven't. I don't know. We're just good as humans at setting up these kind of, it's like pecking orders, and like, I'm better than you, and then we get angry at each other. And I think it's just kind of, we've seen it in history as a cycle. It repeats. And so it makes sense when you look at the future of like, what new divisions. So there's some things being eliminated, but there's going to be new divisions based on things like, and I think technology is a big one of that, one of those things. So.
Yeah. And I find it interesting that you bring up, like, it's hard to imagine a world without a class system, because it makes me think of Thomas More's Utopia, you know, which, you know, I just talked about how I feel like a lot of science fiction is classed wrongly as dystopia just because it has a class system, or it has like a strong focus on a class system. But for anyone who's read Utopia, like, he attempts to create a world without class, and a world without possessions, and a world where like everything is shared in common. And even in doing that, he still has like upper echelon of people, and he still has a slave system, and he still has like soldiers and you know, these different, because it is so hard to imagine a world without class. But I do wonder if some of that also is kind of the inheritance that we have as science fiction writers. You know, if we look at writing in general, you know, and I'm thinking about like Dickens and stuff like that, how they start exposing these classism, and they start exposing, you know, the people who have the ability to read and the ability to buy paper and buy books. They start exposing them through stories, by writing, by creating these books, to what life would look like for someone on the other side who, you know, they don't have access to, who they wouldn't normally talk to or care about. But here's this, you know, this symbol of wealth. Look, you can go spend money on a book, right? Which is the symbol of wealth. And then you have these stories which like change your mind. And I definitely see how in science fiction, classism is attacked in so many different ways, that because science fiction and fantasy is so often used as political commentary and social commentary and as philosophy. So it doesn't just come down to science. Like, it also, I see a lot of, like, especially if we're looking at kind of some of the dystopian stuff, that I wonder how much of that is just like our inheritance as science fiction writers, that's, you know, kind of how we've been taught to, and those tropes that are available. And so when we read all those things, of course, we want to create more of that, you know?
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of it is replication, or inspired or derivative type of, you know, it's inspired by what we've seen and heard. But I think, like you said, a lot of it comes down to like power, and knowing that eventually power, you know, not everyone, but often corrupts, or specifically will corrupt certain people. And a lot of science fiction stories are about power, you know, because it's like because it's all about technological power or resource power, or, you know, it's about power dynamics. A lot of science fiction is. So I think that's why it goes hand in hand a lot.
Yeah. And we do have a freedom in science fiction to imagine a lot of power dynamics that we don't have per se, and just twist them enough so that, like, you know, using aliens and racism, like in Star Trek and stuff like that, or like exposing how we treat poor people by, you know, exposing those things in fiction in a slightly different way.
Yeah. Yep. I think, you know, contemporary fiction, which is what Dickens wrote at his time, right, is more about holding a mirror up to how society looks right now, versus science fiction's about looking into the future.
Yeah.
So there's a difference there too. But
yeah. So do you have like any stories that you in particular kind of gravitate to that feature classism in like a strong light, or that you really like how they treat the subject?
Difficult question. Speaking of Dickens, he's not a science fiction right now. I love his social commentary and how he approached those. Just fascinating to read. But it is, when done well, like societies that are particularly kind of like dichotomous, where it's like, and to the extreme, like extreme privilege versus extreme not, just can be so provocative. And when they're done well, and really kind of, I enjoy that. I'm trying to think of examples. I mean, you definitely had part of it in your series with the pit. I remember how striking that was when we go from the hub to the pit. There's like these two different parts of society. But also like, which I've compared Malfunction to, Escape from New York.
Yeah.
Where you have kind of this prison colony, New York's this prison colony, and it's just like the utter kind of wretchedness of complete chaos and mayhem, and like humanity at its lowest in this little hub, versus how the outside world lives. And kind of I don't know, I enjoy the shock value a bit of when they are so different, if it's done well. But I feel like a lot of people try that, and it kind of like things get and doesn't work. So I haven't seen this one, but I keep thinking about Elysium, but I haven't actually seen it. But I remember just even the trailer always intrigued me about how it's like the rich and wealthy, right, lived on this satellite, I think, and humanity, and it's like, it was almost like heaven. It was so much better than what the Earth was like. And just I never actually saw it, but the concept of it has stuck with me, and the imagery they used was great. Apparently not great enough to get me to watch the movie. I would watch it if I don't know if I ever had like access to it free, or with, you know how it goes.
Yeah.
Like, let's rent something. It never came up, but it's like vaguely on my list to check out. But even just the idea and images of it was interesting to me.
Yeah. What do you think, like you're talking about when done well, are there any like particular instances you can think of when it's not done well, or some things where you're like, I don't want to see that?
This is gonna, I feel like this is gonna be harsh, but I feel like when I've seen it try to be done in YA fiction, it usually falls flat. And I feel like because their focus is on other things, and then they just incidentally put it in these worlds, and it doesn't play. I don't feel like the world building was enough thought was put into it. But I don't want to just brand that all as that. But maybe I do. And I think you pointed out too, I think when dystopian sometimes tries to do that and focus, and this is the other, when it's focused too much on the world and building, and they try to do dystopian or labeled it as dystopian. I don't know. It can get muddled though, I think, when that's like the end all eat too. When you don't put enough effort into that kind of world building and the whys behind it and how the society would function, it fails. But then I think if you focus everything on that, and you don't actually have a solid plot or characters, and it's all about this class system, and you're like, what? I don't know. And then it can fail too. So
yeah. I feel like one of the biggest dangers that I've seen in fiction that is addressing classism is that there's not a lot of complexity. And I think that might be one of the issues with, like, one of the first things that I can think of when I think of like poorly done class systems is like YA dystopian specifically.
Yeah.
So, we had that for a while. Yeah. So I'm thinking about like Divergent and Hunger Games and stuff like that, where, there's these extremes, but they're like, that's not how it works. You have to have a diversified society in order for society not to collapse. Like, you can't just have like a district that deals with coal, and a district that has no fear, and a district that always tells the truth, and a district that, that's not how it works. So you really, like, that's not how society works. But I think there's also, and I had to deal with this a little bit in writing Malfunction, because I had these scenes in the pit where you're seeing kind of the worst parts of humanity, but at the same time, like, you're seeing the worst parts of humanity, like, in the hub. So you're seeing like the worst, and like everyone's just the worst everywhere, right? But there's so much more complexity in class. So it's not just like, oh, you're poor, so therefore you're automatically a criminal, like a horrible human being who's going to murder whoever like turns their back on you for food. There's like, there's like, people are desperate and people take advantage of other people, and there's definitely those situations. We do a lot of crazy things when we're hungry or scared. But I remember there was one specific scene I added in Malfunction of just like someone in the pit who was helping them out when she didn't have to, and it put her in a lot of danger. And just by adding that complexity, like, it added a lot more to my class structure, because now all of a sudden, you have like all these horrible people, and then you're like, yeah, maybe they're not so horrible. Like, there's lots of poor communities where they're very giving and very generous and very loving, and they share amongst each other, and they support each other, and they celebrate each other. And there's a lot of rich people who would and could and are very generous when they have the opportunity and they know how to give. And so, like, always just showing like poor people as like crime ridden and desperate and sad, and rich people as like oppressors. I think that's kind of what I dislike the most. I like to be able to see like there's culture and there's beauty and there's if we just think about like chicken wings, they're on the sake, right? We love wings. Wings are like the worst part of the chicken, right? But there's like a whole culture that they took the worst of the food and they created these beautiful things out of it because that's what they had access to, so it's I think that there's a danger in like compressing it too much and just being like, okay, if you're poor, you're going to be a criminal, and you're rich, you're going to be an oppressor,
Yeah, no, for sure. I think usually there's a breakdown somewhere. I think that sometimes authors or creators don't. It's easy to see, like we were talking about earlier, to see somebody else do it or see the legacy of in science fiction of doing and say, oh, I'm going to do it too, and not realize like how much underlying weight there is of like philosophy. And like, honestly, class system is hugely philosophical and political. And if you don't do your research in those areas, then it's going to fall flat. And I mean, you need to know what you're talking about anthropologically too, and philosophically and politically. And if you don't, it'll break down really fast. And I think it can be hard because I think science sometimes is easier to be like, oh, I need to figure this out. I look it up online and here's the steps of how this works, and I did my research. And it's not always that easy to research those subjects, philosophy and anthropology and politics, because they're so much more infinitely complex. And so I think that's where it can really break down if you don't have a foundation there and you just try to wing it and do some preliminary research. I think it can break down really quickly.
Yeah. And I think this is one area where experience is essential too. And I think that maybe this is why these like shallow class systems are more popular in YA and can pass in YA, is because it's a lot of the, especially American kids who can afford to buy these kind of books, they don't have a lot of experience outside of their culture. And so it doesn't sit as wrong with them as it does maybe for some older people who have had more experience and have seen kind of where these things can go wrong.
Yeah, probably true. And if the story works for them, then the story works for them.
Right. It's about what
And they
is
enjoy them.
entertainment
Yeah,
as
they're
well as,
entertained.
not everything needs to be like deep and heavy and have a million years of research and experience behind it. But hey.
Yes.
So how do you think like classism can be done well or used well in science fiction?
I mean, at its best, it makes you think for sure, and it can draw out the humanity of your characters. At its best, like you said, I think you should be able to see yourself in every class, both your good and the dangers, and be like, oh yeah, if I was there, I would be tempted to do this. Or if I was there, I'd be tempted to do this, and kind of be able to relate on all levels. I think that's when it's done really well, but also be kind of, see the good in the dark in all levels of it. But it can be a really strong tool, like we said, for exploring those soft sciences of philosophy and anthropology, and exploring what ifs, and taking them down these roads of like, okay, our society doesn't look like this, but if it did, and asking those moral questions. So it's like, it can be a really rich thinking ground for that.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I think for me, some of the most powerful class systems in science fiction show you the need to pour into communities and to support your communities rather than to disrupt your communities. Because so often we see like, they're like, oh, I'm going to come in and I'm going to topple it all. And that just ends in a whole bunch of bloodshed, right? Mm-hmm. Whereas, there's definitely science fiction where it's, they build into it instead of just destroying it too. Not a lot of it, though. There's not a lot of science fiction that does that, but I've seen a few.
Yeah, they don't have to all be inherently bad classes. Yeah. Class systems, I don't want to do an absolute that they're all often, I mean, usually, yeah, if there's a class system, then logically there's injustice. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't mean that the entirety of the system is bad, or that all members of one are being violated by all members of the other. You know what I mean?
Exactly. Yeah.
There can still be a lot of health in the system.
Yeah.
So it's complicated. That's why it's not always good to go in and just topple it completely, because it doesn't mean it was all evil to its core. So, and that's when it's a good system, and set up thoughtfully. If you got to that point of like, maybe that's where it's most interesting to me. If it was like you had the ability to destroy it and you realized that would cause almost as much damage, you know what I mean? And then it makes you think, okay, how can we work with the system to slowly bring about change that is good? And that's really realistic to what real life is,
Yeah.
So
it makes me think of Anna Karenina, and I don't think you've read that one.
I haven't read it yet. It's on my bookshelf, but
yeah. So one of my favorite characters in Anna Karenina is his name is Levin, Konstantin Levin, and he's a landowner, and so he is wealthy, but he's very lonely. And so for a good portion of the book, he just goes out and he goes with his field hands and they teach him how to cut wheat, and they're good natured. They're laughing and they laugh about how like he can't keep up with them. And then he gets to know like their families and they invite him over for meals, and you see the ways in like how they feed into him and they give him community and family and strengthen him, and then how he learns from them. But then you also see how he benefits them and how he like learns how to be a good landowner who pays them fairly and treats them justly. And if you understand like what came after, or the Russian Revolution, and then all those kind of things, like it's very interesting to see that kind of like a positive view of class, where it wasn't just like, okay, here comes like this evil, it's almost like undercover boss in like Russia, right? But it's like, yeah, I just really love that view of classism where like, yes, it was almost that he was in a negative position as a landowner because he was he had this burden and this responsibility of caring for them and providing them a place where they can work and where they can where they can feed their families and where they can get food and where, kind of as a business owner is today, where it's like, often they're painted as the bad guys, yeah. Right? But a business owner has so much responsibility for the people who work for them, right?
Yeah.
So they're not always the oppressors. And I think I would love to see more science fiction that digs into that a little bit more. And there's a few examples out there, but I think especially with the dystopian craze, and it's kind of filtered out, but I still see the echoes in a lot of fiction.
Well, we tend to glorify revolution and, really fighting for justice, which is great, but to the extreme of it has to happen now. And so it has to be aggressive and violent. And you know what I mean? Like we tend to glorify the quick change and the sweeping changes and the sweeping upheaval, which takes the greatest courage. But I think it is important to ask, like, okay, but what's the cost there? And are there other ways that change could happen, and what are we tearing down, that hurts people? In that line, though, I really appreciated, as Americans, we definitely have a different perspective on class than England, and I mean, the whole, tear down with the war for independence and all that, the kind of anti-class system and the wanting to be individuals. And Downton Abbey, in this regard, I really enjoyed it. Kind of did a similar thing where, because basically, they're like, they have this title and this big estate and they play a certain role in society. And then the person who was going to inherit it ends up dying. So they have this other relative they track down. They're like, basically, you're going to be the new, you're going to inherit the title. And he's like, looks down upon them because he's like, I wouldn't have servants. I don't need people to dress me or to cook for me or do any of this. And he's kind of, they kind of call him to task and are like, no, we provide livelihood for these people and they take pride in their jobs. And if we fired them, like, where would they go? Like, there's just two sides to the coin. Like, to them, they were a huge part in the village. They provided like hundreds of jobs, pretty much. You know what I mean? And the people who worked for them did take a lot of pride in, like, oh, we get to say we work at this estate and we have a job for our entire lives, which is a huge job security thing. And they would take care of the farms around. Anyway, it was an interesting, like, you got to learn a lot more about some of the British class system, and like, it made you think. It made me think a lot of, like, that's true.
As like a community.
It's never like, you can't take things at face value. It's just there's oftentimes it's more complex, and to see what's actually happening. And sure, someone bad who was in that position could abuse all that power and be cruel, but that doesn't mean that all people in that position are cruel.
Yeah, or that there's fault in that position itself.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's like one of the challenges in Malfunction was, especially because in book 2, certain characters get a little bit more power, and we see them coming into these roles and having to make difficult choices, and especially in connection, like some of those taken to the end of like, what am I willing to sacrifice? Am I willing to sacrifice people that I love? Am I willing to sacrifice, like, not just my own safety, but the safety of those who are most important to me, and my view of justice, and like, I need this justice now, and this is what's right now, but if I press this on people, it'll be too much, and the system will collapse. Or like, how can we survive without taking advantage of people? And I actually took a lot of inspiration from Creation of Jack on that with book 2, Into the Void, where, your character Jack is placed in this position where she's like suddenly in control of people, and where in the previous book she's like
that. She did
no,
not.
she didn't. And I know that she doesn't stay in that position longer than she has to.
And that's, I mean, yes, I will. That's very Platonic in referring specifically to Plato, of the
philosopher king.
Yes, thank you. My tongue, of like the whole concept of people who don't want power are the ones who should be in power. But anyways, continue. Yes.
Okay. Well,
I think on that. Sorry, I had another thought. That's also, I think, into political science, where we get into political science and the whole concept. I was reading some books recently about, the American political system and how, in general, Americans are so afraid of the wrong people taking power.
Yeah.
That they put in so many checks and balances that good people can't get in power and make good changes. And it's an interesting kind of dichotomy where we tie our hands because, I mean, it's a real valid fear to be like, okay, it would be bad if this worst case scenario happened. But are we putting in so many checks and balances that we can't affect good change? And if a good person got in there, they'd have no power to do anything at all. And you kind of get to this stalemate, and it's really interesting. I mean,
on that point, we effectively hobble ourselves. And this might be a very interesting thing to think about in science fiction, too, where if someone is bad enough to take advantage of their position of power and rich enough to take advantage of their position of power, they're going to hop over the checks and balances, where a good person is going to abide by those checks and balances.
I know. It just makes it worse. It is. It's really interesting. And in science fiction, we often go to those extremes and we say, okay, yes, we're going to put the most evil character in power and see what happens. So these questions are all very relevant. And
then I think, once again, we go into the danger of like, this position is evil, or this class system is evil, versus the person in control is evil,
And the exception was so terrible that we think it's the rule, because that's all we can think about is that one time that,
exactly.
It's interesting.
Yeah. Whereas, there are some systems like, I don't think there is ever a positive way to do slavery. But, that there are a lot of class systems that have benefit and that are, can be done well, and shouldn't be, thrown out. So, all right. So, unless you have more to say on that.
No.
Okay. We're going to move on to our final kind of topic, and that is aliens and alien invasion, which I was not a huge fan of till recently, and am finding more and more joy in this trope. But I know that you definitely love it, and I love some of your fiction with aliens in it. So
I don't think I have an alien invasion, though.
You don't really?
Well, sort of. That's true. Watson and Holmes maybe would be the closest. That's not really invasion. I don't know. Yeah. I don't love it per se, but I love it when it's done well.
Yeah.
Because part of me, I feel like there can be this really kind of ickier doomsday side to it that I don't always enjoy. If that makes sense. I don't enjoy it for shock value. I enjoy it because, like we talked earlier, I think you just look around on Earth and see the division among people, and to think if we were, and this is what a lot of the alien trope comes with, if we were attacked by aliens, we would have a common enemy as humans, because it's one thing to be nation against nation or certain race against a certain race, but then to realize, no, we're all humans and this is our home. And now we have this common enemy that we can all fight together. Is really an interesting, I think it's a great trope to explore. Because I think it brings out a whole new level of a lot of things. And fighting for survival. Sometimes, we are quite comfortable in our modern world with our technology, and not everybody has that around the world, but in some of these alien invasion scenarios, it's like evil, you get leveled to an even playing field where you don't have those privileges anymore, and it kind of brings the whole world down back to the state of having to fight for survival, which I find endlessly fascinating.
Yes.
So I don't think you've seen it, but thinking of like what's one of the more recent ones? Now I can't even think of the name. Falling Skies.
Oh yeah, I've seen a couple of them.
Yeah, I don't love everything they did with the series, but especially season 1 and just the foundational framework of how they were trying to survive with this huge, overwhelming alien invasion, and not one that lasted just like a couple of days, which is a common thing. Like you think Independence Day, or even where it seems like it's a short-term thing.
Yeah,
it was like years and years of trying to fight to gain Earth back, which I enjoyed that about it too. But
yeah. There is like it's almost like the opposite of classism. Yeah, you have like the classism is like human versus human, right? Yes. And the alien is like, okay, now we need to get rid of all the classes and just like work together. All the
same. It's true. Exactly. It is kind of the other end. It's like the only it's like because it's like an equalizer where it does kind of eliminate class in that sense of crisis. Crisis does that too. Any crisis kind of eliminates class if it's a strong enough crisis. So.
Which is why it's kind of weird to me. I'm seeing in modern fiction kind of the trope of humanizing the aliens. So then it's an us versus them, but the them is like they have a culture and they have a personality and they have and I know like Ender's Game, for instance, kind of does this in some of the later books, and I actually don't enjoy those aspects as much. But yeah, like I think that sometimes that can be done well.
Yeah.
But I know that I like for Malfunction, I chose just kind of like an animalistic monster to kind of explore the idea of how we like use each other in order to accomplish goals, But yeah, I've definitely seen those. They're kind of the idea of like humanizing the other side as well.
Yeah, no, it's true. It can be tricky because like I said, I usually enjoy it when it's not, when they're like it's the enemy, you know what I mean? And that's because then it can be like this more pure, like we're united against this threat that's evil, and there's no complexity to it, which is rare because war is always, you know what I mean? Like there's kind of something really cool about that, to be like, no, this is an enemy that's purely evil. There's something, it simplifies things in a fascinating way, but it can be like what you did in your series was, even though they had the common enemy, there was still so much conflict between the humans and because of greed and power and all those things, which is heartbreaking, but not unrealistic. But it makes for war within and without, which is it's a kind of a different take on alien invasion. But then also there is, if the enemy isn't necessarily all bad, makes things then things get super, super complex. Because then again, even if humanity united to fight them, they're going to fracture again.
Yeah,
they find out the enemy isn't all bad, and so it can make conflict even more complicated. I'm trying to think of a good example. Ender's Game is a different. I think it's done really well in that it's like the self-preservation of, we assumed the enemy was all bad, and then we find out that they weren't, right? Which is realistic too. But I'm trying to think of another science fiction where it was like, I don't know. I mean, in Star Trek, there's a lot of complexity between alien races and everything, but it's so far in the future.
Yeah.
And it's not like we just, it's like these races are mostly already known to each other, if that makes sense. It's not like aliens attacked and then we had to decide what to do and then found out that they weren't all bad. I don't know. I'm trying to think of an example of that.
Well, the one I'm thinking of, you might not have seen or heard of, and that is Stephanie Meyer, who wrote Twilight, also wrote this science fiction called The Host, which is so YA in so many aspects, but also has some really cool aspects, because she has these aliens that they live endlessly, basically, but they require a host body in order to do it. So they're implanted into, and in this particular story, they're like implanted into human beings. But so the main character is like this girl who has an alien implanted into her, and she like fights back. And so you have that like two entities sharing one body, but you get the mindset of the alien as well. So you see like some of her past lives. Like one of them, she was a seaweed. So it adds some like interesting layers, especially because like the alien turns on her own kind because she like falls in love with human beings. I guess they call it like goes native. So like there's some really interesting concepts there. And I think with Ender's Game, like the fun part with Ender's Game that I think is done really well is that it kind of brings in this idea of like the alien is similar to us, but also unknowable, because like the aliens were attacking the humans not because they hated the humans, they didn't understand, and they humans didn't understand the aliens, you know?
Right. Yeah.
So there was just like a lack of, and like the aliens afterwards like felt really crappy about it, and they're like, yeah, we kind of deserve to be annihilated, but it was a mistake, you know?
Yeah. And what else was interesting about Ender's Game was that the last attack was like so far in the past.
Yeah.
It was like, you know what I mean? There were these gaps in between the attacks, and so that they didn't know anything about the enemy, and it was just like preparing. You know how fear can build up. That's why I think it's so realistic about it over years, preparing for this worst case scenario, and then to do this counterstrike and wipe them out before they could even come. So there were some elements there I think that were really well done that made it different and unique in that aspect. Because the enemy was unknowable, but also fear had been building up for decades, and it was just kind of this desperate strike against them. And we wouldn't have never known that they were actually regretted their actions if they hadn't connected to Ender, which was an interesting. Anyway, so there's a lot of complex elements in that makes it a different tip than the typical alien invasion. Yep.
And then like on the opposite side, we have kind of like the mindless evil, and that The Expanse, is one of my favorites. I know you don't love it quite as much as me. But they bring in that alien element, and it truly is like it's an alien technology. It's not even really a living, breathing alien. It's just alien technology. So it's like this mindless evil that's so far beyond them that they don't even know how to deal with it or how to stop it. And it's just like it doesn't care. It's just accomplishing its goal because it's like a biological computer. And that was really cool. I really like those aspects of it, and some of the like other things they bring in later, in some of the later seasons, where they're dealing with the alien invasion, and yet you like there's no alien, but you're still dealing with the alien invasion.
Yeah, that's interesting. It brings definitely an interesting element to it. More almost naturalistic, like man versus nature, except it's not nature. It's like this, but at the same time, because it's kind of a mindless element. Interesting. Yep, it's interesting. It's definitely interesting to see humans, put at a disadvantage because we're the dominant species here on this planet. But to think like we might not be if we had other species and stuff is really fascinating.
Yeah.
So, there's a lot to play with there.
Yep. Do you think you have a preference between like aliens invading Earth versus like, I know for instance there's some that have actually set it up where like humans are invading an alien planet or space opera or
I don't know. I mean, it depends on how the story's told, and I think because like Ender's Game almost goes there, you know. They don't, yeah, because they go to wipe out. It's a retaliation, but you know what I mean. There's so sometimes they kind of go hand in hand. I think, depending on how it's played out. I just think Avatar sort of does this, but I really did not enjoy it. But it wasn't necessarily for that concept, but how it was executed, of going to this new planet and humans ruin everything, and just the way it was executed was like I think there can be a tendency to lean too far to the like humans ruin everything. You know what I mean? Of like, oh, we're so greedy and we're so aggressive and we're so, you know, selfish that if we go to another planet, we'll just enslave everybody and ruin everything. That I think that there's a tendency to go that direction. I don't enjoy those. I don't enjoy that.
Yeah. I do feel like I see more of like if the aliens are invading us, like it's like it's us versus them, and there's community and there's like, you know, the
misunderstanding. That's where it's more interesting to me. Like, and Starship Troopers has that too. That element, I think, of invade kind of, you know, because they're fighting this huge battle, but they're invading planets. But to them, they're understanding, you know, that this is a real threat and the enemy needs to be destroyed. You know what I mean? Yeah. So I think it can be interesting. I guess I would say then I tend towards the alien invasion more. Yeah. It's more personal to be like, our home is under threat, you know?
Yeah.
Versus going out somewhere else and the stakes aren't quite as high, it doesn't seem like, you know. But definitely there can be interesting things drawn from humans invading other planets, and what's interesting there is the cross-cultural or cross-species, where you can play a lot with that of, you know, making first contact and learning to communicate and all that stuff can be really interesting, but it's a bit more cerebral, I think, versus alien invasion is a very, very personal trope, which makes you kind of look at your world and around you, just be like, oh, I'm so glad that I'm so glad that we're safe and there aren't. But it is also interesting to think, wow, what if everything was taken from me, you know, because suddenly aliens were raining down fire on our cities. Anyway, it's just very real. It can be very real. So
I think you and I kind of differ in that a little bit, because space opera is one of my least favorite genres.
Yeah.
Like the world building aspect can be fun, and like I enjoyed some of the Star Trek that I watched, and like it was fun to watch it, but I wouldn't be like, oh, that's my favorite, you know. But I've seen so many alien invasion or so many like alien first contact stories more than invasion that I really enjoy, or I really enjoy the concept of. Like Annihilation is just like this really cool concept there, or Arrival, which I only got to watch half of, so I don't know if I'm gonna actually like it or not. But yeah, so there's a lot of different ways like you can play with aliens coming to Earth, or aliens doing making first contact in like a, you know, here on Earth, you know, versus a lot of different ways to play that.
Yeah, no, for sure. It's a very interesting trope, and it's good.
Okay, well, we have been going for an hour and 20 minutes.
Yay.
Because we're science nerds. I see someone is watching. I don't know who you are, but hello, welcome. But we are actually gonna, go ahead and close out. So I did want to mention, so Beth just had a book come out yesterday. I'm very excited for. It's
a little bit anything that we're talking about. But thank you.
Yes, well, I mean, definitely check that out. And both of us are Phoenix Fiction writer members, and we have an anthology coming. And so those are science fiction and fantasy. So if you love science fiction and you love fantasy and you want to be exposed to like some new authors, definitely check that out. We have a new one coming next month. So I'm very excited for that.
And check out Jill's Malfunction series.
Thank you so
So
much.
the trilogy is out today and has a bunch of stuff we talked about today, including aliens and class systems and whatever the other one was we talked about. Now my brain is super soldiers.
Super soldiers. Yes.
Yeah.
So many fun tropes, and I really love like digging and delving into all of these. I'm also glad we narrowed it down to 3 because we would have been here all day.
It's true.
I would have enjoyed every moment of it. But
yeah, no, it was a great talk. It's fun.
Yes. So thanks so much for hanging out with me. If you guys have any questions, if you're watching this later or want to know anything, like feel free to drop me a message or comment or whatever. I'll keep an eye out. But definitely you can check out my YouTube, and you'll find there's actually Topside, which is a short story from the Malfunction Trilogy, is on there as a free audiobook. If you head over to my website, there's links to everything, including some freebies. So definitely look around, drop by Beth Stuff, EB Dawson writer.com, and check out her science fiction as well. Because if you enjoy mine, you're definitely going to enjoy hers. So thank you for everyone who's sat and watched this far. Thank you, Beth, for hanging out with me.
Yeah.
All right.
Thanks for having me.
Yes. All right, we're going to say bye. Bye.